We're told the story of a centuries-long war between faith and science, a tale of martyrs, forced silence, and backward thinking. But what if the greatest scientific revolution in history wasn't despite the church, but because of it? Today, we're dismantling the myths and looking at the scientific foundations of the modern world built by the very institution we're told held them back. You picture a scientist in a lab coat. You picture a monk in a robe. Your brain files them as opposites. One believes, one tests, one kneels, one measures. But the real history goes far deeper. For most of the last 1,000 years, the person in the robe and the person with the instruments were often the exact same man. Your idea of a war between faith and science is mostly a modern invention. It took root in the 1800s, decades after most of the events it claims to describe. Two writers are largely responsible for it. John William Draper published a book in 1874 arguing that religion and science had always been locked in conflict. Andrew Dixon White followed in 1896 with an even bigger volume making the same case. Both books were popular. Both books were also, according to later historians, badly wrong on the facts. Historian of science Ronald Numbers spent decades studying this exact myth, and he called the conflict thesis one of the most successful and damaging fictions in the history of ideas. So where did the real story start? It started in the ruins of the Roman Empire. When the empire collapsed in the West, libraries burned, roads crumbled, and literacy nearly vanished with them. One institution kept copying books anyway: monasteries. Monks spent their days hand-copying not just scripture but Greek philosophy, Roman medicine, and early mathematics. Without that unglamorous, repetitive labor, huge portions of ancient science simply would not exist today. You would not have Aristotle. You would not have Euclid. Your brain, right now, holds concepts that survived only because someone in a candlelit stone room decided they were worth preserving. Why would a religious institution protect pagan Greek science? Because early Christian scholars believed something specific. They believed the universe was created by a rational God, which meant the universe itself should be rational, orderly, and knowable. That single idea became a quiet engine. If the world follows laws, those laws can be studied. If God is not random, nature is not random either. This is not a modern reinterpretation. Historian and philosopher of science Edward Grant spent his career tracing exactly this thread, showing how medieval Catholic universities laid the intellectual groundwork for what we now call the scientific method. And those universities were not incidental. They were founded by the Church. The University of Bologna, the University of Paris, Oxford, Cambridge. Every one of them began as a church-chartered institution, often literally growing out of cathedral schools. These were the first places in Europe where a student could study logic, natural philosophy, and mathematics as formal disciplines, under a system of degrees the Church itself invented. You are living in the aftershock of that invention every time you hear the word university. Then came the men who took it further. Roger Bacon, a 13th century Franciscan friar, argued that experiment and direct observation should be central to understanding nature, centuries before the scientific method was a phrase anyone used. St. Albert the Great, a Dominican friar and bishop, dissected animals, catalogued minerals, and taught that faith should never be used to override careful observation of the natural world. His student was Thomas Aquinas, who spent thousands of pages insisting that reason and revelation were not enemies, but two roads to the same destination. You might be thinking of one name right now: Galileo. It is the one story everyone already knows, and it is usually told wrong. Galileo's conflict with church authorities in the 1600s was real, and it was serious, and it ended badly for him. But it was tangled up in politics, personal rivalries, and Galileo's own combativeness, not a simple case of blind faith crushing pure reason. Historian Maurice Finocchiaro, who translated and analyzed the original trial documents for decades, showed the situation was far messier than the clean morality tale you inherited. Even so, this single episode gets stretched across 1,000 years of history it does not represent, covering over the fact that the Church was at that very same time funding astronomical observatories. Because it was. The Vatican Observatory has existed in some form since the late 1500s, and it is still running research programs today, staffed by Jesuit scientists studying meteorites and distant stars. This is not a fringe detail. It is one of the oldest continuously operating astronomical research institutions on Earth, and it belongs to the Catholic Church. Now picture a Belgian priest in the 1920s doing math that would rewrite the size and shape of the universe. His name was Georges Lemaitre. He was a Catholic priest and a physicist, and he was the first person to propose that the universe began from a single expanding point, an idea the world eventually nicknamed the Big Bang. Albert Einstein initially dismissed the math. Lemaitre turned out to be right. Today, the Big Bang is the standard model of how the universe began, and it was first proposed by a man who said Mass every morning. Why does this keep happening? Why do you keep finding priests at the center of major scientific breakthroughs? Because for centuries, the Church was one of the only institutions on the planet that funded serious study of the natural world, trained people to do it, and gave them the time and resources to try. Gregor Mendel, the Augustinian friar who spent years breeding pea plants in a monastery garden, quietly discovered the basic laws of genetic inheritance. His work sat mostly unnoticed until scientists rediscovered it decades later and realized he had beaten them to one of biology's foundational ideas. None of this means the relationship was simple or free of conflict. It genuinely was not. There were real disputes, real censorship, real caution around ideas that seemed to threaten doctrine. Historians who study this seriously, including Numbers and Grant, do not pretend otherwise. What they push back on is the idea that conflict was the whole story, or even the main one. The instinct to flatten 1,000 years of complicated, overlapping history into a single clean story of science versus faith says more about the 1800s writers who invented that framing than it does about the centuries they were describing. Here's what that means for you, scrolling through your feed today. Every time you see a headline pitting science against religion as if they have always been locked in combat, you are looking at the ghost of two 19th century books, not an accurate map of history. The truth is stranger and more tangled than the myth. Monks preserved the ancient knowledge that made the Renaissance possible. Church-funded universities built the institutional shape that science still uses today. A friar mapped genetics in a garden. A priest calculated the birth of the universe. You were taught to see the robe and the lab coat as opposites. The real history says they were, for a very long time, worn by the same hands. If this changed the way you see that history, you know what to do. Hit like, drop a comment with the name that surprised you most, and subscribe so the next story of faith finds you. Until next time, keep questioning what you thought you already knew, and keep praying for one another.